Well, good morning. I'm going to teach everyone out this morning. I want to welcome our visitors. I want to say a thank you to Austin. He did a great job in putting the paperless hymnal together for us this morning. He's been instrumental in getting us this and working hard on this project. We did a trial run last July, and people seem to like it, and he has worked tirelessly for us on that behalf, and I think he did a wonderful job putting it together this morning. This morning's lesson is entitled Godly Women Series Part 2. The title is Sarah, God Changed Her Name. We're going to be looking at our text in just a few minutes in Genesis 17, 15 through 22, but I have the first part of that on the front slide, Genesis 17, 15, and 16. Then God said to Abraham, As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. The picture there is all I could find online about it. It says it's an artist's rendering of Sarah, a portrait. I could not find the artist's name to give credit where credit is due, but it says it's an artist's rendering of Sarah. I really appreciated all the work that the ladies did a couple months ago when I asked for votes on the Godly Women series for their input as to who they would like to hear. I had that in the back for about a month and a half, almost 2 months. And right now, the schedule going through September is in the back for those that would want to see what's coming up next month. And I just wanted to make a note. Your top 3 that you voted for was Esther was number 1, Sarah was number 2, and Eve was number 3. But when I put them in chronological order, the votes edged out for the chronological order those that were just voting for to hear them how they wanted to hear them. So the good news for this morning is those that voted for Sarah for your number 2 pick, well, she is today, she also is number 2 chronologically. For those that voted for Eve as your number 3, we had her last week or last month because she falls number 1 in the chronological list. But for those who voted for Esther, that was your number 1 pick. For those that voted how you would like to hear them, you have to wait till July. She falls into number 7 chronologically, so we will take a look at Esther in July. But this morning, we want to take a look at Sarah as we just read from Genesis chapter 17. There are examples both good and bad in the Scriptures. God doesn't hold back when He tells us in the narrative of His people. He doesn't hold back in talking about those even we might consider heroes of faith. He records for us their weaknesses and He records for us their strengths. And there are some characters that seem to have no redeemable qualities, and there are those who seem that there are nothing recorded negative about them. But God doesn't hold back on those people that the focus is on their account or their story. He tells us their weaknesses and He tells us their strengths. And so the Scriptures are full of people that serve as examples, both good and bad. Men and women alike can provide us with sources of strength and inspiration. As we looked at last month, Eve is an example of moving past sin and giving God the glory in our lives. She gave God the thanks and glory for 2 of her sons, as it's recorded for us in Genesis 4 and 5, as well as serving as a warning to avoid sin. Eve serves as a warning to avoid sin. You know, lots of times we tell people, you're going to be an example either of what to do or what not to do. Eve kind of is both, what not to do, and also gives us hope that we can move beyond our mistakes. We can remember her for not just the mistakes she made in Genesis 3. We can remember her as a loving mother, a faithful mother, one that gave God the thanks and the glory for Cain and for Seth. Godly role models are greatly needed in our society today. They have been needed throughout time, and we see them especially needed again in our day and age. I want to direct our mind now to Genesis 17, 15 through 22. We're going to talk about verse 5 onward in just a second, but I want us to focus for the purpose of this morning's lesson on verses 15 through 22. This passage is telling us, is the passage where God is renewing His covenant with Abraham. Not that it was changed or necessary to renew, but we're human. And so going back to Genesis 12, when God called Abraham out of the Ur of Chaldees, He called him out of his home and said, I'm going to take you where I send you, and I want you to go where I send you. And He says, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to make you a great nation. God, over time, has to keep reminding Abraham of that promise. And here in chapter 17, God is not only reminding him of the promise, but here he makes the covenant of circumcision and says this is the covenant going forward with all of his descendants. And so we find that Ishmael at 13 years old is circumcised the same day Abraham is. But in this passage of reminding him of the promise and making this new covenant of circumcision with him, he changes his name in verse 5. He says, no longer are you Abram, but now you will be Abraham. And we'll talk about that in just a second, the significance of that. And here in verse 15, he not only changes Abraham's name, but he changes Sarai, his wife's name. In the scriptures, names are significant. And when God changes someone's name or gives a name, it ought to cause us to take heed. Did you realize that when Hagar gives birth to Ishmael, God had told Hagar in Genesis 16 to name him Ishmael. Ishmael means God hears. God told Abraham and Sarah to name their son Isaac, which means laughter, or he laughs. And that has a lot to do with the story with Sarah, doesn't it? Both before he's born and afterwards, where she says, all the people that hear about this will laugh with me. Or some translations say laugh for me. Isaac means laughter. Ishmael means God hears. God was telling Hagar he heard her voice. He knew she was in distress. Twice God talks with her. Twice God tells her, your son is going to have many descendants. I'm going to make of him great nations. He will give birth to kings. And here in Genesis 17, 15 through 22, know what God says about Sarai. Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she'll be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. But God said, no, but Sarah your wife will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. We know from the next, or when Isaac is being weaned in chapter 21, that Abraham was distressed when Hagar and Ishmael were sent away. And we're told he was distressed because of his son. He loved Ishmael. And here, thinking in his heart, we're too old to have a son. Ishmael must be the promise when he says, may Ishmael ever live before you. And God says, no, not him. But notice what God says about Ishmael here. He says, as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. God has made that covenant with Hagar already in chapter 16. God's going to make that covenant again with Hagar in chapter 21 when she's sent away with her son, Ishmael. God says, I've heard you, I will bless Ishmael. But he's not the son of promise that I promised you. So he says in verse 21, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. Previous to this, God has been telling him for the last 10 years or so that he's going to have a son. And that he's going to have descendants numerous as the stars and the sand on the seashore. But now God says this year, or this time next year, that's when the promise is at hand. He says the promise is at hand right now. By this time next year, you will have your son. When he finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. A lot of great things here in this passage concerning Abraham and his family, and especially Sarah, as we see in verses 15 and 16. But if we were to go back into chapter 17 and look in verse 5, God changed Abram's name to Abraham. When he called him, going back to chapter 12, when he called him out of the land of his fathers and told him to go to a place that he would send, we read of Abram. Abram is the Hebrew word that means high father or exalted father. And we read that Abram was a very wealthy man, and God continued to bless him. He continued in his wealth. He He continued to stockpile his flocks and his herds, and his family, his extended family, began growing. But God says, no longer are you Abram. He says in verse 5, your name will be Abraham. That is the Hebrew word that means father of many nations or multitudes. So he goes from exalted father or high father to a father of multitudes. And this fits with the promise that God made to him. You're going to be a father of nations. Your descendants cannot be counted unless one can count the stars or the sand on a beach. But God not only changed Abram's name, but he changed his wife's name. In chapter 17, verses 15 to 16, as we just read, God changed Sarai's name to Sarah. Sarai is the Hebrew word that means princess or a female leader. It's often used of nobles. But there's something else about this word. The word that is used to translate Sarai is used in connotation of a self-made or someone acting as leader. So there is a difference of someone who acts as a leader or as a self-made leader versus a leader that is appointed or anointed by God. So there is a subtle difference between Sarai and Sarah. Sarah is the Hebrew word that means princess. And you can say, well, what's the change? Sarai meant princess too. But it has the idea behind it of someone that just declares themselves princess, acts like a royal, perhaps not actually of noble blood. While the word Sarah from the Hebrew means princess, female noble. It can be translated as lady, princess, or queen. Queen seems to fit even better because of what he says about her. He says kings would come from her. In Genesis chapter 17 and verse 5, when God changes Abram's name to Abraham, he says of him, kings would come from you. So he tells Abraham, kings are going to come from you. He says of Sarah, kings are going to come from her, which makes sense. They're going to have the son of promise, the son that's going to give birth that starts it all, the Jews who would be God's people, the descendants that couldn't be counted. Right? So Sarah means female noble or lady, princess, or queen. Sarah is known as a great and godly woman, a mother of nations, truly a princess anointed by God as he changes her name here, or a queen. And much information is given about her in the Old Testament. We actually know quite a lot about her. And there are many references made to her in the New Testament. But what we're going to focus on this morning is God changed her name, showing his regard for her. And he's revealed through the scriptures that he expects her held up as a godly role model. Over and over, we're going to see her in the New Testament held up as a godly role model when she's mentioned. But as we all face in life, and all the heroes of faith have faced, there's a conflict of good and evil. Sarah was a good and godly woman. However, she did have her weaknesses, and I would say as do we all. In fact, if you want to place some markers, because we're going to read it later, Romans chapter 7, 21 to 23, Paul speaks about that conflict within us all. That war of two natures between our flesh and our spirit. Our minds, once we belong to Christ, once we belong to God, our minds want to do what God wants us to do. We want to be pleasing to him. But our flesh wants to do the deeds of the body. Right? And so there's this war of two natures. And we're going to read Romans 7, 21 to 23 a little later on. But you can go ahead and place a marker there if you like. Sarah is no different. As we read of this godly woman, God doesn't hold back the punches. He lets us see her weaknesses. He lets us see her jealousy. He lets us see the lies that she was engaged in. One of those things that is a black eye to her and Abraham is she cooperated with her husband in lying about the relationship. Not just once is it recorded, but twice. And it's implied that even though it's only recorded twice, it's implied that this was a standard practice as they traveled out of the Ur of Chaldees. And so it's possible they did this wherever they went. As we're going to look at in Genesis chapter 20 and verse 12, we find she was Abraham's half-sister, but more importantly, she was his wife. So Abraham tries to say, when he's caught in his lie in the land of the Philistines by King Abimelech of Gerar, he says, what have I done to have you do this to me? You did to me what no man ought to have done to them. And Abraham says, well, she really is my sister. She's my half-sister. So he's saying, I didn't really lie. Yeah, but that's not the relationship God almost took Abimelech and his family's life over. God told Abimelech in a dream, you're a dead man. Not because you have a man's sister. He said, you're a dead man because you took a man's wife. Showing the sanctity of marriage that God has always held. And he says, would you blame an entire nation when we're blameless? And God tells him, I know that you did it innocently of heart, and that's why I've stopped you from sinning against me. So the next day he calls Abraham to task. Why did you do this to me? Sarah was complicit in that. In Egypt, they told Pharaoh she was his sister and brought plagues on Egypt because Pharaoh had taken her into his house. See this in Genesis 12, 10 through 20. In Gerar, the lie was repeated to King Abimelech, who also took her into his house. God threatened to destroy him and his people on account of her in a dream. This is that place in Genesis 20, 1 to 18, where he says, you're a dead man. How many of you would want to hear God tell you that? You're a dead man. Abimelech, who didn't even believe in God, he's a Philistine. They believe in Dagon. That's their chief god. He says he was frightened to death over it and comes and makes sure he makes a covenant with Abraham, not just once but twice that we can see, because he knew God was protecting Abraham. So much so that he even protected Abimelech from sinning against Abraham and had Abraham pray to God on Abimelech's behalf so that he and his family could be healed. God had closed up the wombs of all the women in Abimelech's family. Not only do we see that she was complicit in the lie that Abraham told her to say, Abraham explains to Abimelech that because of how beautiful she was, and he was afraid that both in Egypt and then later in the land of the Philistines, they would take her and kill him. He said that he told Sarah, everywhere they go, say, I'm his sister. And that's the implication that we're led to believe everywhere they went. This was the standard practice, even though these two are the two recorded. But we also see that she sought to help God. And I put help in quotes. She sought to help God keep his promise. In Genesis chapter 16, 1 to 7, a lot of time has passed that they were in the land of Canaan. It has been 10 years. For 10 years, God has been telling him, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you a father of nations. You're going to have descendants that can't be counted. And now 10 years have passed. And Sarai at that time says to Abram, to take Hagar, because maybe that's what God means. And so he listens, we're told in Genesis 16, 1 to 7, he listens to his wife, and so Ishmael is born. But then out of jealousy, Hagar is pregnant. Ishmael's not even born yet. And out of jealousy, she sent Hagar and her son away, her unborn son. So Hagar is pregnant in the wilderness, running for her life. The angel of God stops Hagar and says, where are you going? What are you doing? And Hagar says, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. And God says, no, you go back. Submit yourself to her authority and do as she wishes. And I will bless the child within you. And I will make of him a great nation. And kings will come from him. And so, we see that jealousy come up again in Genesis chapter 21, 9 to 21. On the day that Isaac was weaned, and again, according to customs, that could be up to 3 years old or even all the way up to 5 years old. We're not told. It just says, on the day that Isaac was weaned, Abraham throws a huge party in celebration. And we're told that Ishmael was mocking him. Going back to chapter 17, we know Ishmael was 13. And a year later, so Ishmael could be either 13 or 14 when this happens. Most likely he's 14 by that time. And he mocks Isaac for whatever reason. Sarah sees it, and she treats Hagar unjustly. She treats her meanly. And she tells Abraham that she doesn't want her around because she doesn't want her son to inherit anything with her son. And God tells Abraham on this occasion, while before God told Hagar to go back, on this occasion God says, listen to Sarah, and sends Hagar away. But don't fear for Hagar. God comes to her in the wilderness, comforts her, shows her where water is so she and her son can live, and reestablishes that covenant with her that Ishmael will be a great nation, and that he will multiply and make him fruitful. But out of we see this idea of lying, this idea of wanting to help God with his promises. And here we see twice, at least on two occasions, jealousy got the better of her, and she treated Hagar, she mistreated her, or treated her with abuse, depending on the translation. And she lied to the Lord himself about laughing that she would bear a son. In Genesis 18, 9-15, I mean, this seemed impossible. She's 90 years old. It tells us in the passage that she's beyond the years of childbearing. But here the Lord comes with two angels in the form of humans, and they meet with Abraham, and he throws a feast for them, and he's talking with them, and God tells him face to face, this season next year, you will have a son. And it says that Sarah's around the tent corner listening to this, and she laughs and says, will Sarah in her old age give birth to a son? And God, sitting there with Abraham, says, why did Sarah laugh? And she says, oh no, I didn't laugh. It tells us why she said it. She was frightened. So she lied. But you can't pull the wool over the Lord's eyes. She says, no, I didn't laugh. And he says, no, but yes, you did. You did laugh. It's interesting that God told them to name that child of promise Isaac, which means laughter. Well, she laughed perhaps in a sarcastic or mocking tone. Shall Sarah in her old years give birth to a child? Isaac's name meaning laughter. God is saying, you get to laugh for joy. God says, I'm going to turn that mocking laughter into laughter of rejoicing. Laughter of saying how blessed, how wonderful is God. And Sarah's going to say that herself when Isaac is born, where she says, there's laughter in my years again. And all who hear of this will laugh with me. But despite her weaknesses, despite all these things we can look at that's recorded of her, the good in her life must have outweighed the negative, for she is considered highly regarded by the New Testament writers. She's highly regarded as an example of faith and a role model for wives, even still today, as we're going to read later, 1 Peter 3, 3-6. We all have a conflict between good and evil raging within us. Sometimes it rages within us daily. And Sarah is an example of one who overcame the weaknesses to the glory of God. Let's read now. I said we'd read it a little later. Let's read now Romans chapter 7, 21-23, and see how Paul describes this war of two natures that rages within us. He says, I find in the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. He says, I want to be the one that does good. I want to be holy. I want to be right. I want to be righteous before God. But there is evil in me. He says, for I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man. He says, I want to do what's right. I even agree with what God says I need to do. Then he says, verse 3, but I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin, which is in my members. We can go on through verse 24. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then on the one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other with my flesh, the law of sin. He tells us there's a war going on in the body of even saints. If it happened to the Apostle Paul, it's going to happen to us. If it happened to heroes of faith of the past, it's going to happen to us. He says our mind concurs with the law of God. We want to do what's right. But then the evil that's in us is our body wants to do what the body wants to do. Right? And we have to fight against that. And we have to be the master over that. Just as God once told Cain before he killed Abel, sin is crouching at the door, seeking to devour you, but you must be master of it. You must master sin. That's what Paul is saying here. That's the problem. That's the war. Cain lost that war. Paul's saying we wage a war. There's a war going on within us. Before we start pointing fingers at the heroes of the past and say, oh, look at the mistakes they made. Let's be reminded of the mistakes we've made and where we are simply by the grace of God. That's what Paul's saying. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? He's recognizing, without Christ, I'm doomed. Without Christ, this body will take me into sin and into death, an eternal death. But thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So we do see a conflict of good and evil within Sarah. But let's also recognize that conflict of good and evil within us. And while we can see she was able to master it, we must also master it. One of the things about Sarah is her lasting beauty. She was a physically beautiful woman, one that age seemed not to diminish. I want to point some things out when we read of her going into Egypt and into the land of the Philistines. When we read Genesis 12, 11 to 15, she's about 65 when they go into Egypt. And the Egyptians were taken in by her beauty, which is what Abraham knew. He said, she's beautiful. If they might be so consumed by her beauty, they will just kill me. So then she's a widow and the king can just take her. Notice what happens in Genesis 12, 14 to 15. It came about when Abram came into Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. She's 65 years old. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. What a scary time that would be. Despite Abraham's best efforts, she's still taken. But God had a plan, and God prevented Pharaoh from sinning against God, sinning against Abraham. And so that didn't happen. But I want you to notice in Genesis chapter 20 and verse 2, Sarah here is 90 years old because it falls within the year before Isaac is born. And we know that from Genesis 17, verse 17 and verse 21 when he says, this time next year a son will be born to you. Isaac is born in chapter 21, verse 1. So chapter 20, between chapter 17 through 21, a year has passed. And so this is in that year that before Isaac is born, either she's in her early pregnancy or it's in the 3 months before Isaac is conceived. And Abimelech, the king of Gerar, this is the land of the Philistines, he's taken by her beauty and he takes her into his house. It says, now Abraham journeyed from there toward the land of the Negev. This is Genesis 21 to 2. And settled between Kadesh and Shur. Then he sojourned in Gerar. Abraham said of Sarai his wife, she is my sister. So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And as we talked about this point earlier, God keeps king of Abimelech from sinning before God and sinning against Abraham. So she was physically beautiful. Even in her older years, it seems her age did not diminish her beauty. And that the Egyptians, the Philistines, were taken in by her physical attractiveness. But there are problems with just having physical beauty. There's a saying that says beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is only skin deep, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The criteria of beauty has changed throughout the years. You know this by looking at classic paintings or sculptures. The criteria of beauty could be features, figure, hair, shape of the face or the eyes. The criteria changes throughout time. So there's a problem with just being physically beauty. You might be beautiful at one time and to some people, but not so much to others, right? Because beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We can misjudge a person solely based on looks. Samuel is guilty of this in 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7. Saul has displeased God and disobeyed him twice. So God, through Samuel, told Saul that the kingdom has been removed from him. And on 2 different occasions, one it said he's given to a man after God's own heart. Another time it's told him that the kingdom has been removed and given to his neighbor who is better than him. And then we're introduced to that man in 1 Samuel chapter 16. But in verse 7, as Samuel is told to go to the family of Jesse of Bethlehem and anoint one of Jesse's sons, he's not given a name. God says, I'll show you. And remember, Saul stood a head and shoulders taller than any other man in Israel. So this is what they have in their minds as the idea of a king. And so as Samuel is looking over Jesse's sons, he sees Jesse's firstborn, and he must have been a strapping young man, the phrase might go today. He must have been tall, he must have had broad shoulders, he must have looked handsome, because Samuel says, truly, this is a king. And God says, nope, hard pass. He says, this isn't him. He says, man looks at the outward appearance, but God judges the heart. And then son after son after him. Pass, until David, the youth in the field with the sheep, was brought before him. So it was a boy who was anointed to be the next king, not a man. But that boy would grow into the man that was better than Saul, the man after God's own heart. And even with him, as we look through the life of David, God records for us his weaknesses and his strengths. And through it all comes forward the attitude of one of humility before God and one with a contrite and broken spirit. But we can misjudge a person solely based upon looks. We need to remember, as Samuel was reminded, God looks at the heart. And there's an added responsibility to be appealing inside and out. I want you to look with me in Proverbs 11 and verse 22. I teach lessons on dating from this passage. Proverbs 11 and verse 22. It says, as a ring of gold in a swine's snout, so is a beautiful woman who lacks discretion. What do you think about that? As a ring of gold in a swine's snout, so is a beautiful woman who lacks discretion. Here Solomon in all his wisdom is telling us not to just look at physical beauty. When you think about the picture that he paints for us, he's talking about pigs with gold rings in their noses. The snout is as unattractive as that gold ring is lovely. Right? A lovely woman who lacks discretion combines two opposites, physical attractiveness and moral deficiency. And God places the greater responsibility on that moral deficiency. Right? It's not the physical attractiveness. If one is physically attractive only, I didn't say it, Solomon said it. You're a pig with a gold ring. Right? Don't be pigs with gold rings. Have substance. You know, oftentimes people, to describe someone they may not think is physically attractive, they have a great personality. Remember, God looks at the heart before he looks at that physical attractiveness. So while Sarah had this lasting physical beauty, what the scriptures bear out is she didn't just have physical beauty. We know that physical beauty diminishes with age. Proverbs 31:30 says beauty is passing. The New King James says beauty is passing. The NIV says fleeting. Beauty is fleeting or passing. This gives us the idea that it's not something that is going to happen one day. It's a process that continues to happen. Right? It's fleeting. It's passing. Death destroys all that is beautiful. In Genesis 23, 1-4, death separates and destroys the beautiful. Abraham wanted to bury Sarah out of his sight. Why? Because death destroys what is beauty. Destroys beautiful. God's description of a beautiful woman is what's inside. In Proverbs 31:30, it says, charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. She shall be praised. It takes a godly woman to be truly beautiful and praised by the Lord. I want to go back to Genesis 17 and verses 15-16. God had regard for Sarai, and he changed her name to Sarah, meaning queen or princess, a ruler who is anointed, one who would be a mother of nations, one that kings would come forth from her. Sarah's inner beauty of character outlasts her physical beauty, in that she is a godly role model and example of faithfulness still today. Death destroyed what was once beautiful as far as physical attractiveness goes. We don't know what she looks like. We don't have her in our presence today. But what we do see before us in our minds is a beautiful woman of faithfulness and godly character, and one that God holds up in high regard, as well as the New Testament writers, and we're going to see that in just a second. God changed her name, and she stands as an example of faithfulness. I want to direct your attention now to 1 Peter chapter 3, 3-6. In 1 Peter chapter 3, 3-6. In chapter 2, Peter has just talked about Jesus having humility. And he starts in chapter 3 saying, in the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. We talked about this briefly this morning in this morning's class. As they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses. He's not saying you can't do these things. There are so many people that take this passage and only read this passage and say that getting dressed up or gussied up or you're putting on airs. It's sinful. That's not what he's saying. He's saying not merely external. Remember that pig with gold ring? That's merely external. Don't be the pig with gold ring. He says not to be merely external. It's not wrong to do these things. But he says don't let this be the substance of all there is to you, right? Braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, or putting on dresses. Verse 4, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. Now notice what he says in verse 5. So this is the instruction. He says, in like manner, just as Christ was submissive to God, Christ is used as an example to men and women, and both are given roles, are God-given roles in the family. Christ is the example for both of us, the husband and the wife, of that submission to authority. And he says in verse 5, for in this way in former times, the holy women also who hoped in God. So he's not talking about just women in general in the past. He's talking about godly women. Used to adorn themselves. Again, not talking about just the physical nature, but that inward quality. Being submissive to their own husbands. Notice verse 6. Just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. You husbands in the same way. Again, the same way, going back to chapter 2 and talking about Jesus and the humility that he showed before God. Men and women both use Christ as our example, our ultimate example of using the God-given roles that we have in the family. The husband to be the head, the woman or the wife to be submissive. And here in doing so, notice what he says about Sarah. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children. Remember what God said to her going back to Genesis 17, 15 to 16? Or said about her? Should be a mother of nations. That mother of nations didn't just begin and end with the Jewish nation. All those that carry on that quality, or that inward quality that she has. Women still today can be her children. He says, you become her children if you do what is right. Right? Sarah is held up as a godly role model of a wife. And that wives are called on to look at Sarah and to use her as your role model. She is given as an example of one who is not merely attractive on the outside. By all accounts, she was beautiful on the outside. But that wasn't her only quality. And that's the point here. She had a beautiful inward quality that God loved. And here uses her as a role model for wives in the first century and for the centuries following that. We see that she possessed beauty of character which was very precious in the sight of God, as verse 4 says. This gentle and quiet spirit which is precious in the sight of God. Hers is an adornment every woman, especially wives, may practice, 1 Peter 3:5. Calling Abraham Lord goes against all human wisdom of today, but shows her willingness to submit to him, which is the proper marriage relationship as seen in the analogy of the church to Christ relationship in Ephesians chapter 5, 23 through 32. At the end of that chapter, he says, I'm speaking of things that sound like a mystery, but I'm really speaking of Jesus and the church. So he takes something physical, the marriage relationship, and if it's in its proper roles, its proper context, we can understand the role of the church to Christ. That Christ is its head, and the church must be in submission to him. But the word here that's used, Lord, in my version, it's not capitalized. It's a lowercase l. But the interesting thing is, if you look at that word, it's kurios. It's the same word in other contexts, means the word for Yahweh in the Old Testament, and is equivalent to Yahweh, meaning Lord or God. It's the word that is used of God, the supreme authority. What it was saying about Sarah is that she looked to Abraham as her authority, and she called him as such. This inner quality of beauty is given as characteristics of God's ideal woman in Proverbs 31 and verse 30. In Hebrews 11, 11 to 12, she's given as an example of faith. It says, by faith even Sarah received the ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead at that. Why? Because he was so old. As many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. She is held as an example of faith. She's listed in the Hall of Faith. The other woman listed here is Rahab in verse 31. She was past the age of childbearing. Romans 4:19 describes Sarah saying she had the deadness of her womb. And though she laughed, she had faith it would be done. Going back to Genesis 18 and verse 12. To Abram and Sarai, God promised the impossible. This seemed like an impossible thing. They waited years for God to do in His time what He said He would do. They waited years. Something that seemed impossible. She was past the age of childbearing. But they had the strength of faith to persist through all their doubt and their fears. They overcame their weaknesses to believe and trust in God's promises. You can go back. We don't have time this morning. But I encourage you to read Romans 14:19 through 22. Not Romans 14. Romans 4:19 through 22. And in Genesis 17 and verse 16, God says, by her she would indeed become a mother of nations. He says, I will bless her, she'll be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. And by her faith she did indeed become a mother of nations. In the short term, she became the mother of fleshly Israel. Genesis 21, 1-3. We see Isaac being born, that he's going to be the father of Jacob and Esau. And from Jacob would come 12 sons, and from those 12 sons would become the descendants that are innumerable. But in Romans 9, 8-9, Paul reminds us of that same thing, that she is the mother of fleshly Israel. But then he says, she's the mother of spiritual Israel. I want you to look with me in Galatians chapter 4. In Galatians chapter 4. We don't have time to read the entire passage, starting in verse 22. But in Galatians chapter 4, 22 through 31, she's declared the mother of spiritual Israel. What I want us to look at is in verse 26 and verse 31. It says in verse 26, but the Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother. This is speaking about Sarah, going back to verse 25. In verse 31, so then, brethren, we're not children of a bondwoman, but of the free woman. He's saying of Sarah, she's the mother of saints. She's the mother of the disciples of Christ in the sense of obedience. Her faithfulness. She became the mother of fleshly Israel. She became the mother of spiritual Israel. Through her seed came the Messiah, in whom it was fulfilled, would bless the nations of all the earth, to fulfill that promise God made to Abraham in Genesis 12 and verse 3. As we talked about Eve last month, she was the mother of all living, Genesis 3:20. Sarah became the mother of nations and is the mother of all saints. I can still be the mother of godly wives today. God changed her name. Sarah can be translated as princess or queen. So it's fitting she would be the mother of nations and a godly example of faithfulness. Biblical names are significant and they have meaning. So they are sometimes prophetic. As Jesus was given the name Emmanuel in Isaiah 7:14. Matthew 1:23 says he was called Emmanuel. That means God with us. They're often indicative of character. Genesis 25:26, Jacob was named Jacob. It means heel catcher or usurper. That truly fit him, didn't it? Fit his character. Sarai means princess, but in the sense of one who is self-made or as one acting as a ruler, while Sarah means princess or queen, and she became the mother of nations and of saints, and I could add the mother of godly women and wives. Women have always influenced men for good, as we're going to see with Ruth and Esther, and bad, as Eve and Jezebel. Godly women have influenced godly and ungodly women, and godly women have influenced godly men and unbelieving men alike. Ruth on the people of Bethel and on Boaz. Abigail on her servants and on David. We'll talk about all three of these as the months progress. And Esther on her Gentile husband, the king of Persia. Xerxes I, or Ahasuerus as it's labeled in the Hebrew. In 1 Peter 3, 1-2, we're reminded, in the same way, what way? Go back to chapter 2 with Jesus. You wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any one of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. Peter says, godly wives may save the soul of their unbelieving husbands. With the attitude of humility that Christ displayed, he is the example of men and women alike. Sarah stands as an example of godliness, one who overcame her weaknesses. She overcame that fleshly war waging within her, so that they did not define her, but instead she's remembered by her faith and her virtue. Question this morning is, do you live your life governed by your weaknesses? Will you only be remembered by your faults? Or will you only be remembered by your outward appearance? Or, like Sarah, will you live your life learning from your mistakes, strengthening your faith? Will you be remembered for your faith and your godly character? The admonition for us all this morning, husbands, wives, men, women, children, be a godly role model to those around you. You have that choice now, while we draw breath, to be a godly role model. If you're not a Christian this morning, we encourage you to become one today. You're not serving God, but serving yourself. You can repent and be baptized, rising from the waters a new creature, walking in newness of life. And if you are a Christian this morning, not living the way that you should, not living the way that God expects you to behave, now's the time to make correction. Now's the time to be renewed and be precious in the sight of God in all our behavior. Come forward now. Let your request be known while we stand and while we sing.